Groundhog's Day. Cloudy day here, but evidently the old groundhog saw your shadow, and that really doesn't matter because we know we're only the first part of February. We got lots of winter to come. Anyway, as we look today at our readings in Exodus, we're going to do 4 chapters, 27 through 30. Saturday, as we were finished, on Saturday's reading, it was the construction of the tent of the tabernacle, and then we ended with the doorway, the entry being made, and now we begin looking at the inside furnishings. The altar is the first thing to be made out of acacia wood, and acacia wood was a very dense wood, a wood that didn't rot, and it would last a long time. And so this altar, it says, is 5 cubits wide and 5 cubits long. It's about 7.5 feet square and about 3.5 feet tall, or 4.5 feet tall rather. And so that's a pretty good size altar. But you think about the altars in a lot of our churches they're in that 6, 7, 8 foot wide, but they're not nearly that deep. But we have an altar as a reference point in our worship area. And this altar was to be made out of that acacia wood, and horns on its corners, and overlay it with bronze, because this altar was going to be the altar in the Holy of Holies, I believe, and then it would be the altar, that they would make sacrifices on. Make it hollow with boards, as you were shown on the mountain, and so the altar is made in a specific manner. And then it follows by the court of the tabernacle, with for the altar to be in, this place where the altar is going to be. Then it'd be lined with the hangings, 100 cubits long for that side and 20 pillars, a huge area, really it is. And so it continues with the construction of the tabernacle, the place of worship, and the place of sacrifices as they come to God with their sacrifices. And we'll get into more sacrifices again later too, so this is the altar of the burnt offerings. And when we get to that point of looking at the burnt offerings, the Israelites had to be a wealthy people, and many flocks, because the offerings was to be a pure year-old lamb in the morning and the afternoon, every day, 2 lambs, and that's a lot of lambs over the course of a year's time, plus the bull, plus everything else. But it's just one more of those ways to show us of how God provided for the Israelites, how God took, He says, this is what you do for me. But in the same regard, God made sure to provide for them so that they had everything it was that they needed. So the altar was there, and the court for the altar, and then in chapter 28 we begin with the vestments for the priests, Aaron and his sons. He says, bring near to you your brother Aaron and his sons with him, to serve as priests, Aaron and Aaron's sons. And of course, Aaron and Moses are both descendants of Levi, of the Levitical line. But it's to make the vestments, to consecrate him for priesthood. A breastplate, an ephod, a robe, a checkered tourniquet. And I think about that on Sunday mornings now I very seldom wear my alb and my stole and my the cincture, that the cincture is the rope that you go tie around your waist, and to have a cross on a chain, I very seldom wear one of those on a Sunday morning at worship. But those are dressings of priests, the priestly dressing. And I remember one gentleman in the congregation that we had coffee before worship, and we'd be sitting there having coffee, and about 10 or maybe 15 minutes before worship was to begin, Walter would say to me, it's about time you go start looking like a pastor, meaning, go get your alb and stole on. And, and it is, it's the sign of the office, and it's like, the wearing of the clergy collar. and I remember the first few times I wore that shirt with a clergy collar. You're a little bit self-conscious, but it's showing that you are speaking for God. And so God is providing clothing, vestments for Aaron and for his sons, so that when they are performing their priestly duties, they have that official look, and and then it's the 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 Aaron's priestly robes will be passed on to his sons, and his sons will wear them in turn, as after Aaron has died and is no longer there. But that's all kind of spelled out in him, and they're not just like my stole, my alb is just a white. It's not fancy, but there are some albs that are black, and there are some that are very colorful. I have stoles that are many different colors. I have one that's multicolored, and I've got a quilted one. But they are made to assist or to be a part of the worship, and so it's all set out. And like this robe in verse 31 of chapter 28, you will make the robe of the ephod all of blue. It'll have openings for the head in the middle with a woven binding, like the opening of a chainmail. On its lower hem you will make pomegranates of blue, purple, crimson, and all around the lower hem bells of gold with garland around them. So it's very ornate, I think it's another one of those reasons that when I was growing up, we dressed up for church. I mean, some people still do, and that's really nice. But we don't have quite the emphasis on that in today's society. But still, there's people come and they're intentional about coming to God's house and to worshiping God, and what we wear isn't nearly as important as what's in our hearts and in our minds, for certain. Chapter 29 goes on, and it continues to talk about, the priests and then into the sacrifices, as I mentioned earlier, and it's, as the priests are being ordained and consecrated, there's a service there of for the ordination of priests. You take one young bull and two rams, unleavened bread and unleavened cakes mixed with oil, and it's very specific instructions for that. And when priests and pastors are ordained, for today's society, we still have those. We don't do those sacrifices that way, but we have a ritual that we go through, and we have a process for that, for setting someone apart. And it's, just like a lot of times, I remember many times the installation of church officers, with a new council, installation of Sunday school teachers, and so this is God installing the very first priests, or instructing them how to. And then it's the daily offerings start being talked about, kind of toward the end of chapter 29, and again it's to offer on the altar 2 lambs a year old each day, 1 lamb in the morning, 1 lamb in the afternoon or in the evening, and with the first lamb 1/10 of a measure of choice flour, and so I mean the daily offering was substantial. It wasn't just a mere token, and this is why I look at it and I say that God truly was blessing these people and providing for them generously and graciously, so that they had what they needed to do these offerings. Chapter 30 is other priestly matters, with making an altar for offering of the incense. And this altar was 18 inches square and 36 inches high, roughly. So much smaller than the offering or the altar, for the sacrifice of the animals, and and that altar that those animals were sacrificed on for the ordination and everything was the same altar then that the sin offerings would be would be made on. And so it just continues to talk about the worship area and all of that. And then verse 11, we have a little switch because God says to Moses, take a census of the people. And the census will be a half a shekel for each person over 20. And so, it's another way of God providing for the temple and for the priestly duties that come about. And verse 17 talks about when Aaron and his sons come to do their priestly duties, they shall wash their feet and they shall wash their hands. And it's a symbol of purity, and it's the hand washing ceremonies that got to be so prominent in the Israelites' worship and all of that. And so it all traces back to God's instructions to his people.